Hello and welcome to Wait, It Gets Better, the improvisational storytelling podcast, where like connoisseurs, we taste and review our story from the last few weeks. I am, of course, Levi.
I'm Reed.
And I'm Seth.
And we're here to review a story.
Too much basil.
Yep, well, that's a lie. There's no such thing as too much basil. Too much oregano.
Yeah, no, and cilantro is one of those that you have to hit it. You have to hit it just right.
You Philistine. There's no such thing as too much cilantro.
Oh no, too much cilantro will ruin it. You got to just nail it.
You're one of those guys.
Ew, one of those.
All right, so we are here we're talking about Hero from the Past. That's the name of the last couple episodes. What did you guys think about this one? If you are listening and you don't know what it is, we make a story, and then on the last episode, we talk about it and talk about our inspirations. So go listen to the last 3 episodes, and then listen to this review episode. We can wait.
What did you title this one?
Hero from the Past.
Oh, that was the school teacher.
Yeah, that was the kind of fun school teacher. So in the first episode, I had something based on a book I'm reading, and I had been reading this book by Stephen R. Donaldson, The Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, and it's about a guy who gets sent into sort of a fantasy world and has to deal with that. And that's what I brought into it. So it was a school teacher who was brought into what we eventually decided was the future, a sort of post-apocalyptic kind of, if you think about like how the Shannara series by Terry Brooks or The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan and numerous other books sort of, have it where the world's kind of moved on enough that you can see what's going on, but you can see the past, but there's not still like working vending machines or anything like that.
Yeah, it's a theme of lost information of past civilization, like
that's a
a
good way of
recognition that we live kind of like maybe kind of an agrarian thing. We're just getting food on the table, but we know in the past that there was this fabulous technology that we've just seemed to have lost, and
yeah,
I really like that our guy could access those, turn the bots back on, so to speak.
Right.
Nanobots.
That's one of the things that really gives me the fizz is ancient, like post-apocalyptic systems with ancient and old technology. Those you combine those together in the right way, and it just makes for really good storytelling. It's one of the things I realize I really like about Dune so much. Dune is so feudal in their like politics system, but they're so technologically advanced kind of, but yet they have like the huge outlaw on thinking machines, and so things are still things are really still kind of technically done. It's not your sort of standard futuristic idea where the AI just takes care of everything. That's why I think Dune's probably one of the best science fiction books that exists. That's my opinion. I give Dune a 10 out of 10. What do you rate our story here at, Reed?
I'm going with about 4.
Oh, under half, huh?
Yep. I thought it missed a couple of things. It's a story worth considering. It's a good. It would need some. It would need some fleshing out, I think, to raise it up.
Right, absolutely. I think there was a couple of really key elements that I really liked. One was the Tyrone, the bad guy. He had that people thought it was magic, or people thought it was at least wondrous, but he had basically the withered hand of one of his forebears, who still had like the like implants in it that could like access technology. And so he could kind of wave it around for a little bit and sort of access deep bunkers and satellites and stuff. And then eventually he implanted it into himself to try and get more power from it. And then it started to slowly kill him. I think it's really satisfying when villains sort of become their own demise. You know what I mean? It's one of the things that I really enjoy about the Redwall series is that Clooney the Scourge like goes insane at the end. And the fight at the very end of Redwall, the book, it's kind of the evilness of the bad guy kind of overwhelms him instead of the good guy, the bad guy being totally convinced and totally competent in all of his things. We can see it a lot in history, bad guys sort of overreaching in their badness and it kind of hurting them in the end.
Yep.
That's a theme that I that's happened to me a lot with bad guys in my life. They sort of overplay their hand, and then they fail because you can kind of see them coming. You know what I mean?
Overcook the stew.
Right. Seth, what score do you give this?
I was gonna go with like 5.5. I think maybe like a 6. If we kind of had like a fuller understanding, I would say maybe like a fleshed out trilogy. I think in the story we talked about how this would almost be a sequel to something else, which we haven't done.
Right.
Where, in matter of fact, Charlie, I think it is the hero, but it would be set in that age before, so you would have almost like this, I was going to say Jetsons, flying cars, everyone's kind of connected in nanobytes and the internet, and, they're sending, missions and colonies to space, and, kind of this, futuristic and yet, not too distantly futuristic, kind of super point where they're at, where all of this like kind of setup is taking place. And then you would have this one that we just did, where then, those roles are switched.
Right.
And you're bringing, did we have a name for him? Teach, I think it was. You're bringing him back. And then you would have a third one probably set either, again, much farther along with like showing where this kind of world has come with now, like the re-advance, but now all this time of continual advancement comes back, and you'd have kind of some other kind of tension point with how that looks, right?
Right.
I think one of the highlights of this story was the Charles character. He was the hero sidekick, in this one, but going back to the prequel, he would have been seriously the hero, because as the fit hit the shan, so to speak, and as things were flying apart, he managed to, like the super prepper, build the bunker, get together a good generator system, and purloin a bunch of extra spare parts, knowing that it would have to last, until mankind got back on their feet, and keeping the cryo package together so that Teach and all of his knowledge and connection ability to access the nanobots would be preserved. I mean, that guy really, and then passed it on through the generations. I mean, that guy really performed a hero's task in the prequel, obviously.
Right. Really setting up Teach for the future.
Yep.
One of the things I really liked was how, I know I made it, so I am tooting my own horn here, but how Teach would have come out and gotten access to the nanobots really early on, and would have started out very powerful, just able to like do anything. And then as the story progresses, the saturation of nanobots diminishes, and it's like this, it's like a lesson on how, as you lose power, how to like grow, because at first he could just fight people really easily. But as the nanobots lessened and lessened and lessened, it was like automatic trials as he began to be able to rely on them less. It was like this sort of pendulum thing of, oh, there's less nanobots, you have to rely more. And this is kind of what pushed him to become the hero that he was, is that as they became less, he had to sort of step out, and he had to sort of, make headway, because I kind of imagine him in the prequel just kind of being that, like, he was one of Charlie's college friends, and, he's a genius photographic memory, but he was just kind of teaching middle schoolers science. He didn't really have any ambition for himself. This is like what he wanted to do. And there's nothing to say about a life spent teaching children. I'm not trying to degrade that. But Charlie saw all of this potential in him and maybe even was kind of feeding him information, right? So that this person with like perfect recall and like an excellent photographic memory, he basically used him like a hard drive, and not in a mean way, just in like, if I can preserve you are such a valuable human being. You're going to learn by the time my descendants wake you up, you're going to learn how to like lead these people because you've memorized like everything we need. It's kind of like the whole mentat thing. Dune has like the mentats who have like, right. They think like computers. They have like a computer level system in their brain for the organization of information. And they can be used, but they can also be befriended, and they can be used for good,
Right.
But that's one of the things I liked about the story. I would probably give it a 4, just because like all in all, it doesn't shine brightly amongst the stories we've written, but I think it has a place. Seth and I were talking about writing more expounded universe on a lot of the stories that we've written, trying to tie some of them together, trying to ask the question, are these related? And I think to some degree that this one would make it as far as being related, and it would probably, it would float to the top. Yeah. Not like a dead fish, but as a capstone or a keystone story, when we eventually get that kind of larger conglomerate story system in place. Do you think so, Seth?
I think so. I read it about the middle being that I think it would be a fun read. Even if it wasn't connected to the bigger thing, it would be, if it was fleshed out, I think it would be a fun read, but not something like everyone would go back to, like a Lord of the Rings or
right.
Something like that. Something that would have like a slight, difference of genre between probably what it would be, the 3 different books, with kind Absolutely. Of a tied together tale in between the 3 that would be kind of a, I don't know.
Yeah.
Good enough, but.
Yeah. I think the sort of end goal for my life and this podcast is to take all the stories we've come up with and probably write about 10 very large novels, right? But then write a bunch of like 23-page, 50, 100-page short stories, that kind of support those. Like how a lot of the short stories Stephen King has written are just kind of girders and rivets in the Dark Tower series, It's like The Mist doesn't need to be a giant series. The Mist can just be exactly what it is, which is a short story.
Yeah.
I don't, consider myself a writer. You can't, when do you consider yourself a writer? I think once you've gotten paid for your work, right? That's when you're officially a writer. Is that how that works?
Something.
Yeah.
I have an attribution point here. One of the, I had in the last episode, my story element was random insert, and I had, kind of a thing dropping in on the story that would just obviously change a lot of things. The space mission, from their distant relatives,
right?
And that's from ripped off of Dragon Riders of Pern. And just if you haven't read Dragon Riders of Pern, I just want to do a spoiler alert here, because you want to just read that cold without preamble. So what I'm about to say, you probably don't want to listen to if you want to read those stories. But anyway, there's a civilization that they had 3 ships in orbit actually, and that they were like their motherships, and then they had come down to the surface and they had set up a deal, and then they had cataclysmic things happen so that they were reduced to literally just bare bones survival. And when the old machines stopped working, they were literally like a medieval feudal system. Some strong leaders rose to the top, and they built fortresses because there was an important need for protection and
Right.
and all this. And then the theme, of the whole theme of searching for lost knowledge. They had the bard system, where they had a literally a bard guild, where the storytellers would go to the college and learn, and then they would go out and then they would retell the stories and keep, everybody informed. And so there was that whole spin-off. There was a couple of side books about just the bards. And then they had, of course, the dragon riders, the whole means of defense of these psychic connections with these huge dragons that were sentient but were bonded with the person from their hatching, and it was really a cool story. But that was the the idea that when they realized that those little 3 points of light in the sky were actually the home ships.
Right, that had just been sitting up there for years.
Yeah, centuries. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I kind of like the idea that the ships come back and they're like, we're just like coming to check up on our forebears. What are you guys up to? As like there's a war happening and all of humanity is all broken and they're like
civilization's gone to heck and this is just like picking up the pieces.
Baser instincts.
Yeah.
Yeah. As they come down with their ship made of nanobots and they're like, what's going on here? Like we expected to come back to our home planet and be welcomed by a type 1 civilization, but something happened. Did we ever determine what happened, or was it just apocalypse? Was there a breakdown with something? I don't think it was AI this time.
No, I think it was just probably, I don't know, that Mass Effect.
Right.
Mutual assured destruction kind of thing.
Right, because I know that there were bunkers and people were locked away, the high society types, the rationalists and stuff, because that I think that partially led into one of the great struggles, which was Reed had Pantheon, and his Pantheon was that there was no Pantheon, that people had sort of completely given up on a mystical view of the world and had sought purely rational terms.
Right. But yeah, so I kind of addressed that in the second episode. I had the fighting style, and there had been a kind of a clan isn't the right word, a society of people that entered into, they were martial artists, and their focus was, restoring discipline and character and honor, and they became very powerful fighters. But it was a desire to reach into, there's got to be more to us than just accidents of the universe. We are beings that have the capacity to reach for something higher.
Yeah, and they found it.
Yep.
Seth, any interesting parallels in books you've read from any of your ideas?
I don't think so, except for what we've already gone over.
You only come up with original ideas, Seth.
Yeah. Whatever I come up with, no one has ever thought of before.
Yeah.
All the really good stories are just retold and retold, though.
Yeah. I was thinking, I was listening to this podcast about Tolkien, and these two guys, well, a guy and a co-host, he's reading through Tolkien, and he brought up an interesting aspect, which I was like, we should include in a story, which is that this guy said, let's assume that the copy of Lord of the Rings that we have was shipped to Gondor right after Sam was done with it. That's the one that survived. But it was in a language that needed to be translated to English because of the way that Tolkien wrote this. And the thing that he brought up, because he's like, well, what do you mean translated? Like, obviously it was written in English. He said, yes, but think about the poem about the rings. 1 ring, 3 rings for elven kings under the sky, 7 for dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die. That is pretty straightforward. That's how Sauron would have written that. And 1 ring for the Dark Lord on his dark throne. You think that's how Sauron referred to himself? Like, Sauron classically in the Lord of the Rings was a person who sought to organize things under himself. He wanted to make things right and correct and organize them underneath what he thought was right and correct. He wasn't the Dark Lord to himself. So there is a translation change from whatever the original poem was into the Dark Lord on his dark throne. That is a translator's interpretation of not calling Sauron Sauron.
Yep.
And I was like, my brain just kind of exploded. And I was like, wait a second. And then he started to talk about things like how Merry and Pippin were speaking in the A Conspiracy Unmasked, which is chapter 5 of Lord of the Rings. And he said, so the way that Pippin kind of brought up this thing and said this here, we don't see Pippin acting like that in the story. What probably happened is when Frodo went around to everyone to get their stories to write it down, Pippin said, oh yeah, I said that right there. I said, oh, we should really talk about this then.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't track how Pippin acts. And the same thing with Merry.
You fool of a took, as
Right.
Gandalf would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
An honest fool.
Yeah.
And I was like, just kind of struck with the fact that maybe it's just all superfluous. Maybe it's not true, but it kind of tickles me to think that Tolkien was writing this and taking into an account that it's a written tale compiled by Frodo.
Yeah.
And that written tale compiled by Frodo had to be translated. And that the poem was translated from the Black Speech of Mordor into probably Elvish, right? And then Bilbo translated it from Elvish into the common tongue. And then it was translated from the common tongue into English. And to think that Tolkien would take all of those things into consideration really just means that he is, in fact, the best author that has ever put pen to paper.
Yeah.
Fiction author. Obviously, there's other people who I think, other works of writing that I think are more valuable. But it's just, I was like, if I could find some way to incorporate that, but the problem is you can't force it. You can't force that incorporation. I just have to become a linguist, survive a world war, and then grow up as an Englishman, and then I too can be J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yeah. I think the Ransom character in C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy was literally patterned after J.R.R. Tolkien.
Probably.
Because he was the Tolkien used to take his holiday and go on walking tours and through the highways and byways and check out the pubs in the little villages and here's you got this Ransom that is Professor Ransom, and he's a philologist, which that's basically what Tolkien was. He called himself, and stumbles into this fantastical adventure. Yeah. And anyway, I would have. I've read, if you haven't read the book The Inklings, the talk about Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and his brother Warney and C.J. Chesterton and these guys that they would teach some classes and hold some seminars and stuff, and then around 1:00 they'd meet at the pub and toss back some brews and eat some shepherd's pie and just shoot the crap. And I think I would pay to be a fly on the wall and listen to some of those conversations.
Absolutely. It's so great.
Yeah.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, read CJ unless CJ? He hasn't been on in a while. Yeah. Read Seth, unless either of you guys have any cool ideas. I think I'm going to call this story a wrap. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Wait, It Gets Better as we discuss our cool ideas, our reflections on our stories, but most importantly, give them the score they so desperately crave. If you would like to ask us questions, offer us creative or critical or crucial commentary, send us an email at waititgetsbettercast@gmail.com or message us on Twitter at @getsbettercast. We're available there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We will get back to you, and we will like it. Thank you all, and until next time, don't forget to wait, because it gets better.